Welcome to the National Audubon Society's Rowe Sanctuary on the Platte River in Gibbon, Nebraska. That beautiful chorus that you're hearing is the sound of thousands of sandhill cranes. This is a vital location, one of the world's great animal migrations. Every year in late winter and early spring, most of Earth's sandhill cranes use the Platte River as a stopover site on their northward migration. This is a place of refuge, a place of socialization, and a place of survival for sandhill cranes. For people, it inspires awe, wonder, and the motivation to protect places that migrating birds need on their arduous journeys. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Fitz. I am the resident naturalist with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. And this is Sandhill Crane Play-by-Play, brought to you by Explore.org and the staff at the National Audubon Society's Rowe Sanctuary. I'm joined by two co-hosts today. First, let me welcome in Amanda Hefner, who's the education manager at the Rowe Sanctuary. Amanda, how are you?
I'm great. I'm so excited to share about the spring migration of the sandhill cranes coming through central Nebraska. We're just excited to be here with you.
Yeah, it's going to be great viewing today. And Marcos, we are also excited that you're joining us once again. Marcos Stoltzfus, who is the center director at the Rowe Sanctuary. How are you?
Doing great. It's a rainy day here in Nebraska this evening, but that's a welcome thing because it's been pretty dry. So it'll also give us some interesting things to look at with the crane's behavior, I think.
Yeah, I definitely want to ask about that in just a couple of minutes. But before we get to that, let me go over a few logistics about our program. We're going to be with you for about 45 minutes. We're going to talk about sandhill cranes, their habitat, their migration, and some of the other things that may pop up. Again, we're looking at live footage right now, so if we see some interesting crane behavior, we're definitely going to try to talk about that as well. We're looking at cranes beginning to roost or returning to the river to roost at night. I think we're going to see more and more of the birds coming down over the next hour or so, 45 minutes. And if you are watching on Explore.org's live chat channel right now, or if you're watching on YouTube and you have questions for Amanda or Marcos about sandhill cranes, please drop those in the chats. We'll be looking to answer some of those during the program today. If you are wondering exactly where this is, though, let's take a quick tour and show you the location of the Platte River and the Rowe Sanctuary. We are headed, again, to Gibbon, Nebraska, so the mid-continent of North America. And sandhill cranes can be found along a wide stretch of the Platte River, but really we're kind of focusing our attention today right at the Rowe Sanctuary. The webcam itself is upstream, just slightly, maybe about a mile or so to the southwest of the sanctuary itself. But when the camera is kind of looking downstream, sometimes you can see the center facilities there. We have another still image we can show of the river corridor that marks the webcam location, because I just want to highlight the river corridor itself. The webcam sometimes can see a little bit beyond the river corridor, but the river corridor itself is what we're going to be focusing on today. And that's highlighted here in blue. Let's cut back to the live footage, though, and see what we can see as far as the crane behavior is concerned. Amanda, we moved the time of this program a little bit later compared to our last one that was 2 weeks ago, and I think that was a really good call because we're seeing a lot more cranes in the river right now. What can we expect to see on the webcam over the next 45 minutes, and if people want to watch later into the evening?
So because it's kind of a colder, rainier day here in Nebraska, we see the cranes landing in the river at this time. I wouldn't say there's normally a typical behavior that they do in the evening. It kind of depends on weather conditions and the birds themselves. But usually at the evening, we see them landing in fields, pastures, wetlands that are next to the river. We call those secondary roosts, and we see the cranes land on those, and then basically around sunset, they'll start really coming into the river valley. We notice on really hot days, the sandhill cranes will come in early, or at times they would even come in the afternoon and fill the river bank to bank, almost like they were getting ready to roost that early. But today we're noticing that they came in probably about almost like an hour ago, and they started kind of filling in the river a little bit. It's a little cold and windy here, so they're kind of getting settled for the night early. So we'll see more and more groups of sandhill cranes coming in and landing. They're traveling with their family groups, so usually a mated pair, and sometimes they're juvenile from last year. And so we'll see little groups kind of gathering. They'll start drinking some of that river water. They might even dance a little bit. They'll kind of mark their spot for the night and kind of be socializing a little bit. And that's what we'll kind of see as the evening progresses.
Marcus, you heard that Amanda mentioned that it's, and I'm sure you felt it because you're on site today, but it's a little damp, a little chilly there today. It sounds like that's some welcome change in weather conditions. You've had a pretty dry spring overall. Has that larger dry weather pattern affected the behavior of the cranes? Maybe have some moved early, on their northward migration?
Yeah, I think that's certainly likely. Actually, the wintering grounds, Texas, New Mexico, places south of here, have also been experiencing drought, and that is one reason that the scientists here in the Platte River Valley were speculating that the migration was a little bit earlier this year than last year, because the cranes were leaving those spaces to come up to the Platte so that they can start that stopover for their migration a bit earlier. As far as kind of more recent weather here on the river itself, in addition to the drought, we've also had some really, really hot days. And there have been a few times where the cranes have broken their typical pattern of behavior, whereas normally they are never on the river during the day. They're out in the fields and meadows foraging. There were a number of times where, we had cranes on the river in the very middle of the day, which is kind of unheard of for us. And we think that, in part, those cranes may have had a chance to feed a little while, so they weren't feeling the urge to just go, go, go all the time. But also, there's something to be said about a little bit of water to cool you down on a nice hot day. And we saw some bathing behavior, and there's really interesting opportunities to see cranes under those conditions.
And right now, Amanda, we're looking at cranes. They seem fairly relaxed. We're seeing some small groups flying in. Every once in a while, there's like one crane that maybe gets too close to another one, and a little bit of maybe displacement behavior going on. But generally speaking, when you're looking at this image here, especially like these birds that are the kind of like closest to the camera in our view, if I'm very much a layman and not as knowledgeable about crane behavior as I would like to be, but what can you kind of tell us about what sort of like these individual birds are doing? Like we have a group of 4 moving in at lower right now. Could you mention maybe that there could be small family groups moving in when we see them kind of moving together, walking like that through the river? Is that also the case? Maybe like a mated pair or a pair and a juvenile?
You'll normally see them. They could come into the river in large groups, but they are made up of their core families. So usually that's the male and female. We call them roans and mares. There's a lot of horse-like terminology we use with cranes. And they'll have, we call the chicks colts. But yeah, those juveniles are not quite a year in age, and they'll be traveling with their parents. And so, yeah, here's an awesome video we have of an adult male teaching his young colts how to dance. Dancing is a behavior that sandhill cranes will do year round. You see that coloration of that cinnamon rust color of that young sandhill crane. As they mature, they'll develop that gray plumage. And so, yeah, you'll see them dance a little bit. The Platte River is also a great place for single sandhill cranes to find their match. So you'll see a couple of lone dancers out there trying to attract a mate. Yes, and we see a clip of them bobbing and weaving. And that all happens here on the Platte too. So they'll dance primarily with their mate. So the longer a couple is together, the more nuanced and synchronized their dance moves are. So you see a lot of jumping, dipping. They love to rest those wings on their back, and so they make a bustle. And so You'll notice a couple of cranes ruffling their bustle a little bit as they come in. And yeah, we see some large groups flying in right now. They'll all kind of land, they kind of hold their wings out, and then their legs kind of get very straight and they kind of parachute in and glide in. It's pretty spectacular to watch in mass. So, yeah, that's kind of some of the behaviors we'll see tonight on the river.
And there was a question last time. I'm not sure if we answered it, but I remember reading it in our queue. It was an audience question. Somebody was wondering whether they can recognize each other individually through their calls. It seems like that would make a lot of sense, but I'm wondering if that has actually been determined scientifically. Do we know if they're able to do that?
They definitely know the difference between each other. Sandhill cranes are one of those species where the males and females look alike, but definitely mated pairs can keep in constant contact with each other. Once they're kind of bonded, they spend the majority of the rest of their life together in close proximity. One way we can tell is if we're lucky tonight if we see a unison call. So unison calls happen between mated pairs, and it's kind of them saying like, "Hey, we're a couple. This area is where we're hanging out," and it's kind of a call and response between a male and female. A male sandhill crane will keep his head and neck very vertical. A female will tilt her head at a 45-degree angle and will kind of do a call and response. And so sometimes we see that here on the Platte as they're getting ready to roost, kind of marking that this is the area that they're going to be in. But yeah, it is kind of difficult sometimes to tell the difference between the males and females. But that's kind of why we hear so many vocalizations with our sandhill cranes. And we see some dancing right now in the back, the wing expanding here too. So that looks like it might be a mated pair as they kind of walk in center stage. Yes, they dip a little bit. You see that bustle coming up. So yeah, we get to see some of those lovely actions here. But these cranes are trying to keep in contact with their family, and there's thousands of cranes here at a time. So constantly here in the Central Platte River Valley, we're hearing a lot of vocalizations, a lot of contact calls, a lot of bugling and rattling. You can hear those sandhill cranes anywhere from a mile to 2 miles away. So they're pretty good at being pretty loud and noticeable. We miss them when they leave in a couple of weeks. We'll miss it. We go through
And you
crazy
know, Mike,
calls.
there's a
Go
there's a
ahead,
story
Marcus.
that I've heard told by one of the previous Rowe Sanctuary Center directors, where he was watching a group of cranes that were all on the ground. They were roosting, and overhead a juvenile was flying. And you can often tell the juveniles by their call because it's kind of more of a whistling, squeaky call compared to the adults. And so this juvenile was flying overhead of this group, maybe about, I don't know, I think I heard it was a few hundred to 1,000 cranes. And at one point, there were two adults down in the group that all of a sudden started calling, just like all of a sudden, right? And this juvenile quickly just made a beeline and landed right with those two adults. And to him, that was evidence that A, the parents had heard that juvenile and recognized it, and B, once the adults started calling, that the juvenile recognized the parents and it wanted to be reunited, and by so doing, they were able to recognize each other and get back together. So despite it sounding just raucous to us, they must be able to distinguish each other's voices and keep in touch.
That's amazing, and it's so impressive that non-human animals, they have like their own form of social intelligence, right? And I think that's just a kind of a great example through that story of sandhill cranes, because it looks like chaos to me, or at least it sounds like chaos, but they know what's going on. So that's really neat to hear overall. And you mentioned something too about the soundscape, how much that must change. I mean, over the next, let's say, 2 weeks, you have like this noisy environment. It's really raucous. What's that like though in 2 weeks or 3 weeks? And is it something that you consciously think about? Like all of a sudden the cranes are gone. Like, wow, it's quiet here.
It's a sound of spring for us. Like in different parts of the world, maybe the frog calls, the return of certain songbirds, or the marker. And here it's the cranes. And so it'll sound empty for sure in another few weeks, but there might be a few stragglers that are around. And just as fun as in the fall when they migrate back south, when you start hearing them as they fly overhead, it's kind of a fun reunion. And I kind of tend to say, oh, hey, like, welcome back. You made it through another summer, and it's fun to see them come on through again.
We do have some audience questions coming in, so thank you very much for everyone who's submitted those questions. Uh, we're looking at a relatively wide river. We talked last time during our program how some people described the Platte River previously as being like, what did you say? You said it was like a mile wide and a foot deep or something like that. Not so the cranes can easily stand and wade in the water. That's one of the reasons why it's attractive to them. Ann Jordan, 2651 though, was wondering, has the relatively low water level affected their behavior at all? Is this, some conditions that they would think is typical or have experienced as typical, or are we looking at fairly low water compared to average?
It's hard to say there's an average of the Platte River. The Platte River is a heavily used and dammed river in Nebraska. It goes across basically all the way from west to east Nebraska. And so there's a lot of different entities that are involved with the management of it. But water level is critical in Nebraska, not just for cranes, but also for people here. And so there's a lot of discussion on water usage. And so having really low water, like obviously the cranes need it. That's their, I think the last time we talked about how, these birds are really associated with water. They nest in marshes and wetlands. They rely on the wetlands and marshes for food sources. And here on the Platte, they rely on it for drinking and for a safe place for roosting. So definitely water level has a big impact. And so we work with lots of organizations, federal and state entities too, to work on management of the Platte River. Basically, 70% of water that has originated in the Platte from snowfall, 70% of it doesn't make it to central Nebraska. That much is utilized by cities, by agriculture, as it's making its way to the central Nebraska River Valley. And so what water we have left is really critical. I think a lot of the times you hear water is life. It's definitely life for the birds, and it's life for us too.
Yeah, thank you for actually talking about like water diversions and dams and things like that, because there was I think a question last time about how that might affect uh, the crane. So it's a very sort of like carefully managed system to ensure that cranes do have water at this critical time of the year. One thing that we haven't talked about so far, though, Amanda, is how many cranes are on the river. A lot of people are wondering about that. In fact, we got a question from Jeffrey who wrote in, how many do you calculate are there?
So I think the last time we did this, we had around over 400,000 birds that were in the weekly count that aerial surveys do. This week, we have around 60,000 birds. And if I say so myself, I think most of them are hanging out near Rowe Sanctuary right now. So yeah, we've had some really warm days and some great winds that were pushing north. And so we saw a large group of sandhill cranes kettling, so riding those thermals up and heading north to those breeding grounds and those nesting grounds. So we've seen a lot of cranes leave, but we still have I would say 60,000 is a pretty good chunk out here in Central Platte. So we're pretty lucky that we still get to enjoy the cranes for a couple weeks more at least.
And we've talked about how the cranes are migrating. We haven't necessarily talked about where they're going specifically, though. So, and I think we do have a map available of the Sandhill migration route. So, would you want to talk about sort of like I should have annotated this to mark where Nebraska is on the map, but I'm sure most people can point where that is. But the cranes from the Platte River are going they're, it's not like they're just jumping, to the next county over. They're going very long distances in many cases. Can you talk about how far away they're going?
Absolutely. So this map is made by USGS, and it's of the mid-continent population of sandhill cranes. So these cranes were tagged here in central Nebraska, and so all those dots are kind of where their radio telemetry was speaking back to the transmitter. So the orange dots are their wintering grounds. So you see that down in Texas, on the coast, in New Mexico, those areas. That's where they spend the winter foraging and resting. The green dots show their migration pathways, and then those red dots are the nesting grounds. So here in the mid-continent population of sandhill cranes, we have two subspecies. We have the greater and the lesser sandhill crane. And what's amazing, I think, is there's some differences with those. The graders have longer beaks and are a little bit bigger. But what's awesome, I think, is that those lessers are the ones that you are going to see migrating to the far reaches of those red dots. So these cranes are leaving central Nebraska from kind of staging and stopovering here, and they're going to head up to the northern part of the U.S., the lower 48, I should say. That's kind of where our graders are going to be hanging out and nesting. And then they'll go a little bit into Canada too. But the ones that are doing those far reaches, so northern Canada, Alaska, even Siberia, those are our lesser sandhill cranes. So they're smaller birds. By the time they get up there, those migration pathways could be up to 5,000 miles. They're having even a shorter time to basically raise their young before they need to start migrating again. So they're a pretty resilient bird species, and it's pretty amazing that they can go all the way to Siberia. And we actually have had a couple of Eurasian cranes or common cranes that are not a North American crane species actually meet up with some of those lesser sandhill cranes in Siberia and just decide to migrate through North America and give it a try. So we've actually had some sightings of common cranes this year in Nebraska, which is pretty unique and kind of speaks the volume of how far these birds are actually, migrating.
Well, I bet that was a treat for anybody who wanted to add a common crane to their life list and didn't want to leave
Yeah.
North America to do it. So yeah, we did have a question from Tom Hayden 8340, who's wondering where is their final breeding destination. So Tom, I hope that answered your question. Can we talk? Maybe Marcus, I'll toss this to you. We would talk a little bit more about like their breeding habitat. It's quite different than what we're seeing here directly on the Platte River. So Jack's mom was wondering, do they nest in trees or on the ground? So what is their breeding habitat like typically, if we could sort of stereotype it?
Yeah, well, because these birds are coming up into the far northern reaches of Canada, Alaska, that kind of thing, they're often in pretty remote boreal forests with a lot of kind of marshy, boggy kinds of wetlands throughout. And so they tend well, they will nest on the ground. Often that'll be out kind of in a very shallow wetland situation, and they'll kind of build up a bit of a mound. It can be a few feet across for their nest. And in so doing, they're kind of protected or at least a little bit away from some predators if they use that strategy, so that if something's splashing around, they'll be alerted to it. But in terms of kind of their reproduction, they'll usually lay one or sometimes two eggs. And for the most part, they're generally going to be raising one young successfully. Every now and then, if you have some experienced parents who really know what they're doing, you might have two colts that are raised all the way to adulthood. But more often than not, we'll see two parents with one colt, as they're coming through Nebraska at this time of year, as they're the final leg of that journey that they'll do with the colt from that would have been raised the prior summer. So those young birds are getting the lesson of how to migrate northward from here. And then once they get up to those breeding grounds, the parents are going to kind of say, all right, that's it. get kicked out of the household. You got to go find your own way. And the parents will then, of course, breed and try again to raise another successful round of offspring.
And if we can for just a moment, maybe we can bring back that clip we have of the colt dancing with their father, because we had a question from Kelly who wrote in, how old are the babies when they fledge? Is it called fledging when the birds walk around before they fly?
Yeah, so we would say that usually a young colt is going to be able to have first flight between 65 and 75 days. And that's really what we mean by fledging, is that they're ready to fly and they're learning how to do that. So this young one here, it's kind of looking like it's still pretty downy. It doesn't have any flight feathers. It's just kind of going through the motions. It's a cute little bugger too, if I do say so myself. But this one's a ways off from being able to start to get a little bit of airborne, maybe take some test flights and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think this one's actually only around like 17, 18 days old. So you can see how big those chicks can get because they're pretty small when they're born. In such a short time period that they're learning what's safe to eat, learning how to dance, learning how to fly, learning how to survive.
And I'll also say too, I think this is a pretty good, if people are wondering what their breeding habitat looks like, this is a pretty good example of it. So just sedge meadows, bogs, um, you know, well vegetated wetlands is where you can often find them, or most often find them reproducing. I want to get back to live footage here for just a moment. We've had such great views of cranes that compared to like our last program a couple of weeks ago, we haven't really like seen the horizon very much because there's been so many cranes close to the cameras. But I know that the uh, the Rowe Sanctuary is helping to monitor sandhill cranes when they're flying in the local vicinity, because if people, any of our webcam viewers, any of our webcam fans have probably noticed a lot of power lines crossing the river, and collisions with human-made structures are a major hazard for birds across the world, especially in North America where there's a lot of that infrastructure. So I think this is a great opportunity maybe to talk about what you're doing to try to study that and mitigate it in the future. And kind of a leading question that we have, this is actually a question that came in during our last program, but it came from NW Nature, who wrote, it is amazing to watch the thousands of cranes as they arrive in large groups. Are there any fatal collisions? And I think NW Nature was wondering between cranes, but I'm wondering about sort of like the infrastructure, like the power lines and everything else in the vicinity. Marcos, I know that you have, are interested in this, and you talk about it with the public frequently. So what can you tell us to maybe start our discussion about collisions in birds in the local vicinity?
Yeah. So the kind of collisions that we're concerned with are not, bird to bird. If that does happen, it's kind of very fleeting and not a huge deal. The thing that we're worried about is collisions with human infrastructure, like you said, and in particular on our property where there are so many birds, in high concentrations, with the power lines themselves. So here on screen, you can see some images from our, night camera that shows those power lines in the background. And the problem that we're concerned about in this kind of a scenario is if the birds flush for any reason, a predator or loud noises from human origin, at night in particular, if there's not any kind of mitigating technology that's included, as they flush, they may go straight up and then hit those lines themselves because they can't necessarily see them as well as during the day. And so they can't avoid a collision, and that can end up in injuries or fatalities, in the worst case.
And I think we have another clip that might show some lights on the power lines a bit more clearly than this one. In this clip, there's a our producer Candace, I think there's another one from the 30th of March, if we can pull that up. I want to get to this clip and talk about that in just a second. Yes, but thank you very much. You can see, Marcus, there's like a string. I think people have kind of nicknamed it almost like a necklace across the power lines there. Can you talk about what those lights are and how they might work, hopefully to warn cranes that there's a hazard there?
Yeah, so the necklace that you're describing would be the string of lights that's mostly horizontal, just above the horizon line in this image. And rather than actually being lights themselves, what we're seeing there is a reflection on some hanging, I guess, reflectors that are on the power lines themselves. And what is being reflected there is actually ultraviolet light. So something that we did as kind of a pioneering type of technology that had not been tested before, back in 2021, we installed some ultraviolet lights on the power poles, shining across the river to try to illuminate these power lines. So you can think of it as a big flashlight, but instead of being white light, it's ultraviolet light. And that is a wavelength that the cranes are very attuned to, that they can see very well. But of course, as humans, like we can't perceive that, with a high degree. You can kind of see the purple of the bulbs if you're out here in person. But the idea is that that's going to illuminate the power lines more readily for the cranes. And when we first installed those, we did a study and we found that ultraviolet light reduced collisions by up to 88%. So it's a huge benefit in our book to make sure that there's fewer of these interactions that are going to end up with cranes being injured or killed.
Well, that's really great to hear, and thanks for that explanation as well, because I didn't know that those were actually sort of reflections off of other lights. Because we have some photos of those UV lights that sort of shine towards the power lines, and these came in from one of our esteemed camera operators and moderators for the crane cams, Deb, who's been very helpful in providing a lot of these images that we're seeing here at night. I know Deb volunteers time to monitor cranes along the power lines to see how effective these warning signs can be for them. Maybe, Marcus, while we're still on this topic, we can get back to that sort of like there was an infrared video that we showed earlier, and I think that really illustrates well how many what the hazard of these power lines can be like. And Deb actually just made a pinned comment in the Explore chat on the Crane Cam talking about an experience recently where, this image, there was a lot of cranes flying above the power lines, as you can see. But, just like last night or the previous night, there was a lot of cranes flying very, very close to the to the power lines, and how significant of a hazard that is. So I wonder, Marcus, if humans were able to put themselves in a crane's mindset here, maybe that would help us to have a bit more empathy for these birds when they're dealing with so many hazards.
Yeah, I think you're nailing it, Mike. I mean, I think the key is that we've put this piece of infrastructure up as humans, and so as Rowe staff and as Audubon staff, we had decided to explore this technology, feeling an obligation to try to mitigate those collisions. And so the color images you showed of those purple lights shining across, that's a really great depiction of exactly what it took for us to put this in place. And I'd mentioned a previous study that happened in 2021. This year, we've upgraded those lights because they were starting to deteriorate a bit, and it was brand new technology at the time. And so there's now, better manufactured options for the lights themselves. And this year, we're doing a secondary study to follow up. And what we're doing this year as a new variable is some nights the lights are off, some nights they're on. But then the new piece is that there will be a 1 second on, 1 second off pulsing pattern. And so that infrared video that you showed is an example of what the researchers are seeing in the evening to make observations and catalog the different birds, not just cranes, but other species as well, their reaction to those different variables so that we can measure and try to see if that on-off pulsing pattern is effective. And, our working hypothesis and hope is that if it is, that can reduce the cost of these units, because with the light only on half the time, that reduces the amount of battery that's needed and the solar panels to power it. And it could then theoretically help to make the technology more affordable and therefore provide more wide-scale adoption at other locations where there's kind of critical bird use on habitat that does have power lines going across it.
And Mike, I'll just add that that's really important for all bird species and also for cranes worldwide. So most of our crane species worldwide are vulnerable or close to being endangered, and so it's really important to protect the habitats and the places that these birds need. And we're part of those landscapes too. And so in areas where there are power lines, the study could have big ramifications, and we're really looking forward to how it's going to play out.
Well, I'm glad you're undertaking that effort, because it could make a big difference in the current lives of cranes and in their future as well. And we were talking a little bit before the program how arduous migration is for species that undertake that journey. And we, even with that's excluding all the human-made hazards. So yeah, if we should be doing our best to mitigate those hazards, and ensure that birds can reach the destinations they need to go to survive and reproduce. And we're back to live footage now. We're going to be with you for another 7-8 minutes or so. Great look at cranes hanging out in the river right in front of us on this sort of like cool wet day on the Platte River. We did have an audience question that came in from Flower Bear, who was wondering, and I think we've been seeing this behavior on the camera while we've been talking, but sometimes we see, the cranes sort of all walk in maybe a similar direction. So Flower Bear was wondering, when they all walk in the same direction, are they moving into the wind or with the wind or moving for some other reason? Or maybe, Amanda, is there some sort of social cue, like follow the leader thing going on?
Yeah. So basically, when they land, they're looking for the best spot to kind of stay for the majority of the night. And so a lot of the times we'll see them land and then just start kind of filling in the river, bank to bank. And so making room for some of those late arrivals into the river. Yeah, they're just kind of trying to find the best place for them to kind of settle down. And when I say settle down, I mean for them to get some shut eye, essentially. At some point in the evening, the cranes will quiet mostly down. They can be pretty loud throughout the night. But yeah, they'll stay kind of in those big groups, but they'll kind of walk until they find the right place. And then they might stand on one leg, might do some preening, but then they'll kind of tuck their heads in and get a little bit of sleep. So yeah, they kind of start to make room, because essentially when one crane lands, the rest are like, all right, it's time to come in. It's a safe time to come in and roost. So they'll land near it. And so as more and more cranes want to come and land, they need to start spreading out a little bit. So that's what we kind of see. And sometimes when they land, they're like, this is not the place for us. So you'll see some of that leaning pre-flight behavior that we see, where they kind of lean very hard in one direction to indicate to the rest of their group that they're going to take off into flight. And so they'll lean pretty hard and be at a pretty sharp angle, and then they'll start getting ready to take off and fly. And they might fly and find a different portion of the river valley that they want to stay in. So.
And Amanda, follow-up question to that I have is, when they're sleeping, are they kind of sleeping with one eye open? Do they shut down just half their brain? Because I know that
Yeah.
birds have that capability, and I was wondering if the cranes in the river are doing that.
Yeah, they definitely do that. They also have some cranes that, stay awake a little bit to kind of look for predators. They're pretty loud even in the evening. If you want to, you can continue watching the crane cam into the evening and listen to them. I know a couple people fall asleep to the crane cam, and we love that. But yeah, they definitely do kind of shut off that portion of their brain as they're getting some rest.
And this is our final sort of Sandhill Crane play-by-play of the year. I know sort of like the tour season is wrapping up for the both of you at the Rowe and the other staff at the Rowe Sanctuary. The majority of the cranes have already flown north, and I definitely want to do these again next year. So we should pencil in some dates next year for these programs. But I wanted to get your perspective on sort of like what cranes mean to the both of you as we were sort of concluding our broadcast today. You know, being there, being able to experience them in person. Marcos, you kind of mentioned it right at the beginning or earlier in the program where it's like, hey, it's the sound of spring. So what sort of, emotions does that evoke in you? What when the cranes return?
Yeah, well, I think, like you said, it's a sign that we're back in another season, and I know that for a lot of folks, that's the case for them too. There's visitors who come every year to experience this phenomenon that can't be found anywhere else in the world, and so I guess for me, there's two parts to it. The first is just experiencing it myself, having done it many times. Even going out a few weeks ago and seeing them come in at night or take off in the morning, it's still just awe inspiring. And so I get to experience that myself. But the other part for me is watching others who are seeing it for the first time. It just reminds me of what an honor and a privilege it is to be stewards of a place that has such an important role for so many birds. And to see people experiencing that is just a real joy and a reminder of why we're doing the conservation work that we do.
Yeah, what about you, Amanda? When the cranes return or when they leave, what sort of like uh, emotions or meanings do you think about or feel?
I think sandhill cranes are such an amazing species, especially because they're just such a great example of resiliency. I mean, these cranes have been, I think the oldest sandhill crane fossil is 2.5 million years old. When we say cranes are ancient, we really mean that. They've been utilizing these landscapes longer than, some of these landscapes have existed almost. So we've seen in the last 200 years, these sandhill cranes adapt to huge landscape change here on the Platte with, agriculture being kind of predominant on the landscape and cities popping up, and they're still able to survive. They're still able to, grow in their population and still find a home here. And I think that's such a amazing story in itself. And as someone who is a lifelong Nebraskan, grew up here along the banks of the Central Platte, I didn't always appreciate the cranes as much as I do now. And I feel like there's such a great story behind them, beyond just the normal migration stories and things like that. That resiliency I really admire, and I think we can all learn something from cranes in that retrospect.
Yeah, thanks to the both of you for those answers. I mean, it really makes me think about cranes in a different way, especially when we're tying it to the idea of resiliency and how rapid the landscape changes across North America have been over the last few hundred years, especially the last 200 years. And the cranes are still here. They can thrive if we give them the space and the habitat and ensure that they don't face too many hazards, man-made hazards in their journey. I want to thank the both of you again for taking the time out of your day to join us for these programs, and it comes at your busiest time of the year where people are coming to enjoy the cranes. So I know this is sort of like an extra duty for the both of you, but I sincerely appreciate it, and I hope our audience enjoyed learning from the both of you. I certainly did. So thanks to the both of you once again.
Yeah,
Thanks
you're
for
very,
having
very
us.
welcome. It's been awesome to be here. And, the Crane Cam is a great way for us to share this with folks all over the globe. And so it's our pleasure to be able to do the play by play and looking forward to doing it again.
My guests today have been, or my co-hosts, I should say, have been Amanda Hefner, Education Manager at the National Audubon Society's Rowe Sanctuary, and Marcos Stoltzfus, the center director for the Rowe Sanctuary. My name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. The crane cam is going to continue all through the night as well, so go to explore.org right now if you want to continue watching and enjoying the cranes. And we'll be back hopefully next year with some more Sandhill crane play-by-plays. Have a great day, everybody, and enjoy the cranes.